Welcome to the Nebraska History Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Goforth. Each episode, we explore articles written and published in the Nebraska History Magazine. Today, we are joined by Gail Blankenau, author of the article Journey to Freedom from Nebraska Territory, which was published in the summer 2022 issue of the Nebraska History Magazine, which is mailed quarterly to Household Plus members of History Nebraska. Gail is a professional genealogist, historian, speaker, and author. She holds an MA degree in history from the University of Nebraska-Kearney and won the James L. Sellers Award for the article of today's show. Gail, thank you so much for joining us on the Nebraska History Podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So let's get started with the article. It's centered around the experiences of two young women who were slaves in Nebraska during the mid-1800s. Now, we were talking a little bit before the show. The topic of slavery in Nebraska, it's not one that's very well known. So give us a little bit of background about how you came across this story about the Grayson sisters and what was your inspiration for researching and writing about it?
Thanks, Chris, for that question, because usually the first thing I hear when I talk about the book is not so much a question as an exclamation. There were slaves in Nebraska? Really? I thought we were a free state. Well, people kind of forget that we started with the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854. We didn't become a state until 1867. So technically, yes, we were always a free state because it was a few years after the Civil War finished. That said, we have this territorial period and in absolute controversy. A lot of people don't realize that though most of Congress really wanted to extend the United States territory westward, every time we extended into a new territory, the problem of slavery raised its head. And it raised its head in a big way when Nebraska started.
So you came across this story about the Grayson sisters, and we'll talk a little bit more about the article and their story. How did you come across their story in particular?
In particular, it kind of as almost a curiosity, slavery in Nebraska, a couple paragraphs, isn't that interesting? And then they move on. Kind of dismissive too, because they would say, well, there were never very many. And then there was this phrase in almost all of them that I became kind of suspicious of. It was, Nebraska never voted positively for slavery. And I thought, well, what does that mean? And so I had to know more. And I did know about the two women. I started out not knowing their names, but I was also in a class for history. And that class was a great class. And they said, well, we want you to use primary sources for your final paper. And you might want to look at territorial history. And it didn't matter whose territory. It was a class with people from all over the country. But territorial history has a lot of opportunity. And right away, filed away in my brain, I thought, oh, what about those women who escaped during the territorial period at a time when people were fighting a lot about slavery? So it started as a final paper. My professor and I talked about it. He said, wow, this was really something. And I said, yes, and there's so much more. I want to write more about it. So then it became a thesis. So this is the paper that became an award-winning thesis that became a book.
As you said, this started as just a couple of paragraphs. The history of this story was just a couple of paragraphs. Talk a little bit about that process of taking that little bit of information and then expanding upon it and turning that into a book.
Yes, because again, I thought this was perfect for a final paper, but it really was perfect for a book. And what I found is online, there are a lot of digital newspapers. So I started trying to comb and see what did people at the time, what were they saying about what happened, rather than what historians were saying a little bit later about it. Because one of those historians was J. Sterling Morton, who was from Nebraska City. And he knew much more about this incident than he ever let on. Probably because when you lose, you're kind of on the losing side of a ideological debate during the Civil War. You kind of want to not emphasize that part of your history. So I started in digital newspapers. Also, History Nebraska Archives has tremendous primary resources, which is why it was such a great topic for me. The Nuckolls family papers had an account book that talked about some of the enslaved people. It had some transfers of slaves from one person to another. And it also had Celia and Eliza's exact birth dates, including the time of day they were born. Wow. So talk about a wonderful primary source. Then as I started reading, that's when I realized this was not just a local story. This was national news. It was national news in 1858. It was national news in 1859. There were even accounts in British newspapers about the incidents surrounding their dramatic escape. And then there was a separate, but also extremely dramatic incident in Chicago in November 1860, right after Abraham Lincoln was elected, but had not taken office. And once again, national news, and President Buchanan even weighed in on the second incident. So I realized that there's a reason that this was national news. And if it merited that much attention then, maybe it's time to look at it much more deeply now.
Gail Blankenau is joining us on the podcast today. She is the author of the article Journey to Freedom from Nebraska Territory from the Nebraska History Magazine. So you talked about finding out that this story was not only locally significant in Nebraska at the time, but you discovered this had national significance and even was internationally significant in some ways. Why was this story so significant, and how did it impact the discussion about slavery in the United States?
That is a great question. It's one of the questions that I sought to answer when I wrote the article and the book. And one of the reasons was indeed their location in Nebraska Territory. Another part of the answer is that, you know how they say if it bleeds, it leads in journalism?
Yes.
Well, there were some really violent incidents that followed their escape. Because their enslaver, Stephen F. Nuckolls of Nebraska City, crossed the Missouri River after them and sacked an entire town, engaged in torture, engaged in assault, and there were a lot of legal repercussions of all of this as well. But when they left, they are saying there were slaves in Nebraska. Then people were saying there are slaves in Nebraska Territory. Really? And then there were people from Nebraska Territory, knowing there were enslaved people here, saying, no, nothing to see here. Maybe a few, but they're happy and they're almost like indentured servitude and they're happier here. At least they're not down in a plantation. I mean, all sorts of excuses for the fact that there actually were enslaved people in Nebraska Territory. So when Celia and Eliza leave, number one, it was the surprise. Really? It's working over there? You told us it could never take hold there. What's happening? And the other thing was, did Mr. Nuckolls have the right to pursue them under the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850? You know, back then, people were really much more informed about a lot of these things because that had been a huge controversy as well. So Celia and Eliza's escape challenged the narrative about popular sovereignty, which was let the people of the territory decide. They challenged the narrative about the Fugitive Slave Act, and they challenged the Kansas-Nebraska Act as well. Because what was ambiguous was the territory free until the territorial legislature voted on it, or did they have to wait until statehood and put it in the Constitution? Southerners thought you had to wait, which meant you had this grace period of having slaves during the territorial period. And then, of course, the Northerners, even Northern Democrats who were not as comfortable with slavery, but were going along with it because they were Democrats, even they were saying, yeah, popular sovereignty, that's the way to solve this. Just let the people of the territory decide. That's the only way they even got the Kansas-Nebraska Act passed. So when they crossed that river, they crossed more than a river. They crossed so many lines that the story resonated on all these different levels of controversy. Were they enslaved or were they free? They'd lived in what people were presuming to be free territory for 4 years.
Well, as the debate around slavery was continuing to grow. I noticed in the article you share that there were not only just slaves in Nebraska, but there may have actually been active slave sales occurring in Nebraska City. Talk about why this was such a big part of that story.
Oh, yes. The so-called fake slave sale, which we still can't quite make our way through to know whether it actually took place or not. They placed what was a very standard ad for the time, offering slaves, 5 slaves, terms easy, it said. And terms easy means borrow the money. We will lend you the money to buy these people's labor. And when it came out in the Nebraska City News, and that particular issue of the Nebraska City News isn't existing anymore, but it was reprinted across the river in Iowa. Well, and then the national news picked it up on the news service from Iowa and said, what is going on? And then J. Sterling Morton, who was the, as you know, the father of Arbor Day, and, who doesn't love planting trees? I think it's great. But he was the editor at the time. And after it became very controversial and people were saying, oh no, slavery is extending into the West, and just lots of upset over it because most Northerners did not want to extend slavery into the West. Mm-hmm. And they'd been assured that it wouldn't happen. And here it is happening. And a sale of slaves in Nebraska City. And then Sterling Morton said, oh, I was just kidding. I was just testing the waters. And, we could talk about the ethics of that all day long, but half of the editors said, oh, well, yeah, maybe. Well, he wanted to get some attention and he got attention. And others said, we don't believe it. And the fact is, there was such a practice of hiring out, and there were many, many sales that were never recorded in a courthouse. So the fact that I can't find it at the courthouse doesn't mean it didn't happen.
Right.
And I do wish that those issues of the Nebraska City News were still in existence, but they're not. And hey, call to anybody out there that has old newspapers in their drawers or anything. Are any of them Nebraska City News from the 1850s?
Yeah, everyone take a look.
I want to see them.
Gail Blankenau is joining us today talking about her article, Journey to Freedom for Nebraska Territory, in the winter 2022 issue of Nebraska History Magazine, which is mailed quarterly to Household Plus members to History Nebraska. Getting into the article a little bit more, as we mentioned, this article is centered around 2 sisters, Celia and Eliza Grayson. Now, they were not originally from Nebraska. Talk a little bit about how their story starts and how they came to arrive in Nebraska.
They were born in the 1830s in a place called Grayson County, Virginia. And the Nuckolls family that enslaved them were Ezra Nuckolls and his wife. And then later on, Celia and Eliza were transferred by Ezra to his son, Stephen F. Nuckolls, who became the founder of Nebraska City. Now, Stephen Nuckolls decided that he wanted to make a fortune out west. And so he came west, but not to Nebraska. He came to a place called Linden, Missouri, which is in the northwest corner of Missouri. Now, Missouri was a slave state, so it was fine that he brought Celia and Eliza and a male, probably Shaq, who was likely their brother or half-brother. And he brought them, and then later on, they were there for 6 years before they crossed the river in 1854 into Nebraska City to settle. Before that time, Ezra Nuckolls, Stephen Nuckolls' father, and the rest of the family came to Northwest Missouri. So they were wrenched at ages 9 and 11 away from their family to go live in Missouri for 6 years. But just before they crossed the river into Nebraska, they were reunited, at least with some of their family members, when Ezra decided to make the move west. So I do have a little part. There's a book. We're talking about the article, but there's a book that talks about what it was like to be on the Missouri River in a steamboat at that time, and some kind of descriptions of what they might have seen, that I tapped into some diaries of other travelers along the same route. So it was a long, arduous journey. They'd already started over in Little Linden, Missouri, and then they had to start over all over again in 1854 in Nebraska City. And Nebraska City then was not a quiet place. It was bursting at the seams. It was one of the major routes that people going west on the Oregon Trail were taking. Nebraska City initially was larger than Omaha, and they hoped, of course, to be the major transportation hub on the Missouri. So there was a lot of competition for that along the Missouri River in those early years of Nebraska territorial history.
So we'd love to go through every little bit of the article because it is fascinating.
So
we encourage people to pick up a copy of the magazine or the book, which we'll talk about in a little bit as well. But let's jump a few years ahead to 1858. At some point late in that year, the Grayson sisters make the decision that they are going to flee. They're going to get away from the Nuckolls family, and they're going to head east to where they ended up in Chicago. Now, as you said, Nebraska City is next to the Missouri River, but according to the information you found and wrote about, it looks like they decided not to cross the river at that point, but instead traveled north first to a small town of Wyoming, Nebraska. Now, talk about the early parts of that journey and some of the challenges and dangers that they faced.
Yes. Well, I think Nebraska City, I just said that it was very lively.
Yes.
Now, by November, it wasn't as lively, but it was still much bigger than Wyoming, Nebraska. And also, Stephen Nuckolls had tremendous political clout as well as financial clout in the town. He not only started the town company, but he was one of the major bank owners. So you didn't really want to cross him. I believe that they were able to find people. It was a safer place for them to cross, even though it would take a little longer to get where they wanted to go. It was safer. And I really think this reflects great planning on their part, because little known fact, most people who sought their freedom in the 1850s failed. They were recaptured. Mm-hmm. But for them, what are the consequences of being caught? Almost certainly corporal punishment, and almost certainly being sold south. So the stakes were very, very high. So they went, we don't know whether it was by foot or by wagon, but they went about 7 or 8 miles north to this place that's no longer in existence, but I have been there, and you can see the old wharf of Wyoming. Wow. It's now dry because the Missouri has been channelized and changed so much. It's much narrower than it was then. The Missouri was also very dangerous back then. It was famous for what they called eating boats. There were lots of submerged branches, swirls, starls. I mean, you're just constantly seeing people dying, trying to cross the Missouri River. So they're not only crossing at night, but they're crossing when the ice is running. So they're getting into this little skiff. And a skiff is simply another word for a flat-bottomed small boat. And they're being rowed across by a man named John Williamson, who was a black Cherokee who was from probably Oklahoma Territory, and had been brought north. And he was a free black person living in Civil Bend, Iowa, with a group of abolitionists that lived there. So that's where they were headed, their first stop on the Underground Railroad. But first they had to get to Wyoming, they had to get into the boat, and then cross at night with the ice running. I can just imagine the ice, can you? Oh, yeah. Bashing against the hull of the ship, and, they're hanging on probably to this small rocking boat. And I don't know if you've ever seen, I'm sure you have, I like to look at those satellite images of the United States and how lit up it looks all the time. But there are still black spots, and one of them, of course, is in Nebraska.
Right.
But then all this area was that black. So think about doing that at night in November 1858.
Yeah, truly harrowing journey. And of course, the dangers and the challenges didn't stop there. I mean, I'm sure as the story tells, and you alluded to it earlier, Nuckolls didn't simply allow these two to just leave and just wash his hands and go, oh, well, I guess it's done. Talk a little bit more about his reaction and the actions that he took after learning about their escape.
Yes, he was a very determined person and very decisive, and he was used to kind of being in control. So he gathered a mob. It really did turn out to be a mob. And he searched both Tabor and Civil Bend, Iowa. Civil Bend is mostly underwater today, but Percival, Iowa, for some of your listeners, is where the old Civil Bend Cemetery is. And so it's Percival, Iowa today is the closest thing you can get to Civil Bend. And the scenes that happened here, where they took off is now dry land, but where they landed is now underwater.
Interesting.
So that tells you how much the Missouri has changed. He actually engaged, for instance, in torture. He went to a different free black family that lived in Civil Bend. They were called the Garners. And they had just lost their father. And so there were 7 living in that house in Civil Bend, ages 20 to about 4. And they took the 20-year-old and the 18-year-old man and they took them down to the bottoms in the forest because there were some trees lining the bottoms there. And they basically did a mock lynching of Henry and trying to extract information about where Celia and Eliza were. And this was part of the national story. People were just horrified by the scenes that were described that this mob engaged in. They shot at people. They beat people with canes. And Stephen Nuckolls was sued by Henry Garner, who was black. So that was a big deal. A black person suing a white person. And he was sued by another man named Ruman Williams, who was white and who had lost his hearing in one ear permanently. He never did get his hearing back from a beating that he took as they tried to extract information about Celia and Eliza's whereabouts. So there's no lack of courage and persistence in this story.
Well, and to continue that on, the sisters do end up making it to Chicago. At least we know for sure that Eliza Grayson was definitely there, because in the article it talks about how Nuckolls received word of Eliza's presence in Chicago, and he didn't even stop there. He continued the pursuit. In the interim between the Civil Bend incident, which was very famous, and the Chicago incident, he waited a year because back then there was something called the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. And that was also controversial because it made it easier for slave catchers to chase people into free states. And free states before then had a lot of laws about habeas corpus and other things protecting black people from being caught and maybe enslaved when they were free. And we do have some stories about free people being enslaved, just based on the color of their skin. This made it easier because this law said that the locals had to help people to catch slaves, and they did not want to help. They did not want to help. So he goes in there and he sues 16 Iowans under the Fugitive Slave Act. And that again prompts, that's why the debate kept going on. They left in November 1858, but well into 1859, they're saying, on what grounds is he suing these Iowans? Fugitive Slave Act, they were on free territory and he sacked this town. I mean, it just really incensed people. But the district court in Otoe County allowed the suit to go forward. There was some doubt. Will they even say he has standing? It said, yes, they are property under the laws of the United States. So even the people were saying there's no slavery here. Well, clearly there is, because he just was able to get a suit started under the Fugitive Slave Act. So he's chasing them then. He explains that he has hired people to chase them. And he explains that he has expended $10,000 trying to find them. Which is a lot of money at that time.
That's a lot of money.
Yes.
So, yes, there were people pursuing them for the whole time.
Gail Blankenau is joining us as we discuss her article, Journey to Freedom from the Nebraska Territory. It's a harrowing experience. It really is. Just reading this, and it's written in such a wonderfully narrative way. You kind of get a feel that you're right there with these sisters. And as you said earlier, this was something that started small as a couple of paragraphs. You do the research, you discover that there is a massive story to tell, and it ends up becoming a book that you have recently released. And tell us a little bit about the book, because obviously there's more information in there than in the article. So let's start off by, can you give us one little nugget that is in the book that you learned about that didn't make it into the article, but is still worth sharing?
Oh, there's so much.
That's a tough question.
One of the great things about doing history is it gives you the opportunity to correct errors, but also to expand on what we do know. And this book does both. I correct a couple of errors. There were several actual histories of Nebraska, that said their half-brother, and they didn't know, number one, that they were sisters or brothers. That I was able to find out through my research. There were several indications that maybe Shack was also a freedom seeker and that he left before them. Other accounts said he left after them. I discovered that he was sold south. Oh. And I can prove it, because I also found some letters in private hands that Lucinda Nuckolls, what they would have called a mistress back then, wrote back home to Virginia. And one of those descendants very generously shared those letters with me and scanned them and sent them to me so that I could complete some of this primary source research. Another one was that there was another enslaved man named Shade in Nebraska City, a very familiar figure in Nebraska City at the time. They said that he was owned by Stephen Nuckolls, but he never was. He was always owned by Ezra, but he was in Nebraska City as being hired to work for different people, but especially Stephen F. Nuckolls. There was this big kind of legend that he became a South Carolina legislator later on in life. And there was a man named Samuel Nuckolls that they said, well, Shade's real name was Samuel. People just make stuff up, I swear. So that was not that hard, but I still did the work. Who is Samuel Nuckolls? Could it possibly be Shade? And it wasn't. It wasn't at all. So, that man actually testified in front of Congress because he became a congressman from South Carolina. And he was so harassed that during Reconstruction that he was called on to testify, and they asked him where he was from. He said, I was a hard-down slave born in South Carolina at this place. So he was definitely not Shade from Nebraska. Mm-hmm. Expansions would be tangentially related to Celia and Eliza, but kind of gives you an idea of the context of the times. You'll also read about Hercules and Martha being sold on the steps of the Otoe County Courthouse. And that story has been told and retold over and over. But I found in the archives here in Lincoln a letter that a woman from Nebraska City wrote back to New York to her aunt that gave lots more detail about that sale. And I mean, arresting, just heartbreaking detail of how they tried to escape when they realized what was happening. And the woman was saying, please help me, please help me. I mean, it just all these things that no one had ever mentioned before. It was always just, there was one slave sale in Nebraska ever. And it took place here. And they even got the woman's name wrong sometimes. But that's one where I did a little correction, but also a major expansion of that particular incident.
It is a truly amazing story. The book is available. You can find it with the Nebraska Press at nebraskapress.unl.edu. It's available at amazon.com and also at the gift shop here in Lincoln, Nebraska at the Nebraska History Museum. So if you'd like to pick that book up and learn more about the Graysons and the topic of slavery in Nebraska. It's truly fascinating to learn more about something that isn't readily taught and just to get a better understanding of how Nebraska in its territorial days influence and impact that conversation across the entire country. Gail, I really do appreciate you taking the time today. I'm glad we got the opportunity to speak about your work and the research that you've done on this important aspect of Nebraska history. And thank you for doing that research as well.
Thank you, Chris.
And thank you for listening to the Nebraska History Podcast. To learn more about Nebraska History Magazine, to listen to more podcasts, or to support our podcast by becoming a member of History Nebraska, go to history.nebraska.gov/podcast. Until next time, for History Nebraska, I'm Chris Goforth.